Protest. It's an action to express what we want.
We face the difficulties of today and tomorrow. I still have a dream.
Often protests come at a great cost, sometimes even requiring the ultimate sacrifice.
They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
A recent example from Bangladesh, the Quota Reform Movement, has shown the world what people can achieve when a government refuses to meet their demands. But this is just one instance. In this video, you'll discover the top 15 protests around the world that have made history. Number 15. Bangladeshi Student Quota Protest. Bangladesh, a nation with a rich legacy of activism, has seen its people mobilize for various causes, from the 1952 language movement to the 1971 Liberation War and resistance against military rule. In 2013, the Gonojagoron Moncho movement called for justice for war crimes committed during the 1971 war, stressing the need for accountability. In 2018, the Nirapad Sharik Andolan emerged, focusing on urgent road safety concerns and calling for substantial reforms. During the same period, a separate quota movement began, leading to a government decision to ban all quotas in government jobs. However, this ban was soon overturned by the Supreme Court, which reintroduced a reformed quota system. The new system reserved 56% of government jobs, including 30% for the children and grandchildren of freedom fighters, sparking widespread protests in 2024. Students, frustrated by the quotas they saw as unjust and obstructive to merit-based hiring, led large-scale protests. These demonstrations resulted in significant losses, including the deaths of Abu Sayyid and Mir Magdo, drawing national and international attention. The government's response included imposing internet blackouts and curfews to control the unrest. Ultimately, the crisis led to the fall of the Bangladeshi government. The country is now led by an interim government under Nobel Peace Laureate Muhammad Yunus. This transition marks a new chapter in Bangladesh's political landscape, with hopes for meaningful reforms and stability moving forward. Number 14. The Civil Rights March on Washington. The Civil Rights March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, held on August 28, 1963, stands as a defining moment in the American civil rights movement. This historic event was meticulously organized by civil rights leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, who had long advocated for economic justice, along with Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin. Their collective efforts culminated in a march that drew an unprecedented 250,000 participants to the Lincoln Memorial, making it one of the largest peaceful demonstrations in U.S. history. The event's most memorable moment was undoubtedly Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, which has since become a cornerstone of American rhetoric. His call for an end to racism and for the realization of true equality resonated deeply with those gathered, as well as with millions more watching the event unfold on television. It significantly influenced the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two landmark pieces of legislation that addressed racial discrimination and voting rights. The March on Washington remains a symbol of peaceful protest and a testament to the enduring struggle for civil rights, reminding us of the power of collective action in the face of injustice. Number 13. The Kent State Shooting Protests. The Kent State shooting on May 4, 1970 marked a dark and defining moment in the history of American protest. Amidst the heated atmosphere of Vietnam War opposition, students at Kent State University in Ohio gathered to protest the U.S. military's invasion of Cambodia. The protests began peacefully but escalated over several days, prompting Ohio's governor to deploy the National Guard to the campus. The tragic events unfolded when the National Guard, equipped with rifles, opened fire on unarmed students. In a mere 13 seconds, 67 shots were fired, resulting in the deaths of 4 students: Allison Krause, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schauer, and William Schroeder, and the wounding of 9 others. The shock and horror of this incident reverberated across the nation, triggering a wave of protests at colleges and universities as students everywhere grappled with the stark reality of government force being used against peaceful demonstrators. The Kent State shooting intensified the anti-war movement, symbolizing the deepening conflict between government authority and the right to protest. Despite the public outrage and the ensuing legal proceedings, accountability for the soldiers involved was minimal, with no one held criminally responsible. Number 12. The Iranian Revolution. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's rise to power began in 1979 when he led the Iranian Revolution, overthrowing the Shah and establishing the Islamic Republic of Iran. Once in power, Khomeini quickly consolidated his authority, suppressing political opposition and implementing strict Sharia laws. Among these was the imposition of mandatory hijab laws in 1981, requiring women to wear headscarves and loose clothing in public. This marked the beginning of widespread discontent among Iranian women who had initially supported the revolution with hopes of greater freedoms. The hijab law became a symbol of broader restrictions on women's rights, affecting their education, employment, and personal freedoms. Over the decades, Iranian women engaged in various forms of resistance, from quiet defiance to organized protests against these oppressive measures. The situation escalated dramatically in September 2022 with the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Amini's death, reportedly due to police brutality, sparked nationwide protests with women at the forefront. They burned their headscarves, cut their hair, and chanted, "Women, Life, Freedom," a slogan that encapsulated their demands for basic human rights. The protests quickly grew to encompass broader grievances against the government, including issues of corruption and economic hardship. Despite harsh crackdowns by security forces, the protests persisted, drawing international attention and support. This movement marked a significant moment in the ongoing struggle for women's rights and freedoms in Iran. Number 11. The Anti-Apartheid Protests. In the 1980s, the fight against South Africa's apartheid regime gained unprecedented momentum, fueled by a wave of global activism that reverberated across continents. The apartheid system, a brutal form of racial segregation and discrimination, faced mounting pressure as people worldwide took a stand against it. During this pivotal decade, international protests became a powerful tool in challenging apartheid. Across the United States and Europe, activists organized mass demonstrations calling for boycotts of South African goods and divestment from companies doing business with the regime. On university campuses, student groups rallied for divestment, targeting institutional investments in South Africa as a means to undermine the economic foundation of apartheid. These protests weren't just about raising awareness, they were about driving tangible change and isolating the apartheid regime on the global stage. The collective pressure from these global efforts contributed significantly to South Africa's economic and political isolation, setting the stage for future negotiations and reforms. By 1990, these mounting pressures played a key role in dismantling apartheid, demonstrating the profound influence of international solidarity and activism in fighting systemic injustice. Number 10. The Tiananmen Square Protests. The Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 marked a turning point in Chinese history as students and citizens alike took to the streets of Beijing to demand political reform, greater freedoms, and an end to corruption. What began as a peaceful student-led demonstration in April quickly swelled into a massive movement, with tens of thousands of people from all walks of life joining the call for change. The protesters, inspired by ideas of democracy and transparency, occupied Tiananmen Square, turning it into the epicenter of their demands for a more open and accountable government. As the protests grew, so did the Chinese government's anxiety. By early June, the leadership under Deng Xiaoping decided to use force to quell what they saw as a threat to the Communist Party's control. On the nights of June 3rd and 4th, the government deployed the military, sending tanks and armed troops into the square. The violent crackdown that ensued led to the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of unarmed civilians. The exact death toll remains unknown due to the Chinese government's strict censorship. The immediate aftermath saw a brutal suppression of any remaining dissent, with widespread arrests and an enduring silence on the topic within China. Internationally, the crackdown was met with shock and condemnation. putting China's human rights record under intense scrutiny. Number 9. The Occupy Wall Street Movement. The Occupy Wall Street movement, which began in September 2011, emerged as a powerful protest against economic inequality and the outsized influence of corporations on politics. The movement was triggered by a call to action from the Canadian magazine Adbusters and quickly took root in Zuccotti Park, located in New York City's financial district. OWS employed a decentralized, leaderless structure, emphasizing grassroots democracy and collective decision-making, a hallmark of its identity. With the slogan, "We are the 99%, the movement sought to bring attention to the vast disparity between the wealthy elite, particularly the top 1%, and the rest of the population. This rallying cry resonated with people across the globe, leading to similar protests in cities worldwide. OWS participants used innovative tactics like human microphones and general assemblies to amplify their voices and ensure that all could participate in the discourse. Despite the initial surge of support, OWS faced significant challenges, including confrontations with police, legal battles, and the logistical difficulties of maintaining an outdoor encampment through the winter. These hurdles ultimately led to the dismantling of the Zuccotti Park encampment in November 2011. OWS shifted the conversation to economic justice, sparking broader discussions about wealth distribution, corporate accountability, and the need for systemic reform. Number 8. The Chilean student protests. The Chilean student protests of 2011 marked a pivotal moment in the country's history. The protests were fueled by widespread frustration over the high costs of education, the deep inequalities in access and quality, and the dominance of for-profit institutions in the sector. These issues were seen as symptoms of broader social injustices that had persisted since the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s. Led primarily by university students and high schoolers, the movement quickly gained momentum with mass protests, nationwide strikes, and widespread occupations of schools and universities. The students' demands were clear. They called for free, high-quality education for all, an end to profit-making in education, and increased public investment to ensure equity across the system. The government initially resisted these demands, offering only partial reforms that did little to address the protesters' core concerns. However, the persistence and scale of the movement forced the issue onto the national agenda, leading to significant public debate and eventually to concrete policy changes. The protests also had a lasting impact on Chilean politics, helping to galvanize a broader movement for social justice and influencing the agendas of subsequent political leaders. Number 7. The Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, which unfolded between late 2010 and 2012, was a wave of anti-government protests and uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa. The movement was ignited by the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire in protest of police corruption and economic hardship. His act of desperation resonated deeply with Tunisians, sparking massive protests that ultimately led to the ousting of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali after 23 years in power. Tunisia's success inspired similar movements in other countries, most notably in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria. In Egypt, the protests culminated in the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak, who had ruled for nearly 30 years. Libya saw the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, but this victory led to a civil war that has left the country deeply fragmented and unstable. Yemen's uprising contributed to a prolonged conflict that continues to devastate the nation. Meanwhile, in Syria, peaceful protests against President Bashar al-Assad's regime quickly escalated into a brutal civil war that has caused immense suffering and displacement. The Arab Spring highlighted the widespread discontent with authoritarian regimes, economic inequality, and social injustice in the region. Number 6. The Hong Kong Umbrella Movement. In the summer of 2014, Hong Kong became the epicenter of a dramatic showdown between pro-democracy activists and Beijing's central government, marking a defining moment in the city's struggle for political reform. The Umbrella Movement erupted as a response to Beijing's restrictive electoral proposals for Hong Kong's 2017 chief executive election, which many viewed as undermining the city's democratic aspirations. This vibrant movement saw thousands of protesters flood key areas in Hong Kong, including Admiralty, Mong Kok, and Causeway Bay. Their demand was clear: genuine universal suffrage and a more autonomous governance structure. The movement earned its iconic name from the umbrellas that protesters used to shield themselves from tear gas and pepper spray, symbolizing their resistance against the government's attempts to stifle their voices. Despite facing intense police crackdowns and the eventual dismantling of protest camps, the umbrella movement made a significant impact. It drew global attention to the growing tensions between Hong Kong's democratic ambitions and Beijing's tightening grip. The movement's peaceful protests and symbolic use of umbrellas captured imaginations worldwide, sparking discussions about human rights and autonomy. Number 5. The Women's March on Washington. The Women's March on Washington, held on January 21, 2017, was sparked by the inauguration of Donald Trump and his administration's perceived threats to women's rights and social justice. The march was initially conceived by activist Teresa Shook, whose idea quickly gained momentum through social media. Prominent organizers like Linda Sarsour, Tamika Mallory, and Carmen Perez helped shape the event into a powerful statement of resistance. An estimated 500,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. to participate, while millions more joined sister marches in cities across the globe, from New York and Los Angeles to London and Sydney. The protests highlighted a range of issues, including gender equality, reproductive rights, racial justice, LGBTQ+ rights, and environmental concerns. The Women's March played a crucial role in revitalizing grassroots activism, leading to a surge in political engagement, particularly among women. It also laid the groundwork for subsequent movements like the hashtag #MeToo, which further amplified the fight against sexual mistreatment and assault. However, the march also sparked important conversations about inclusivity within feminist movements, highlighting the need to address the concerns of women of color and other marginalized groups. Number 4. The Gilets jaunes, Yellow Vests, protests. The Gilets jaunes, or Yellow Vests, protests began in France in November 2018 as a grassroots response to a proposed fuel tax increase. What started as a movement against rising fuel costs quickly grew into a broader expression of discontent with economic inequality, high living expenses, and a perceived disconnect between the government and ordinary citizens. The name Yellow Vest comes from the high-visibility vests that French motorists are required to carry in their vehicles, which protesters adopted as a symbol of their movement. The protests were characterized by widespread demonstrations, road blockades, and at times violent clashes with law enforcement. Major French cities, particularly Paris, saw weekly protests that often turned into riots, with the demonstrators expressing anger not just at the fuel tax, but at the broader economic policies of President Emmanuel Macron, whom they saw as favoring the wealthy over the working class. In response to the sustained pressure from the protests, the French government eventually suspended the fuel tax increase and introduced a series of measures aimed at easing the burden on low-income citizens, including tax cuts and increased wages for some workers. Number 3. The farmers' protest in India. In late 2020, India's agricultural landscape was rocked by a massive wave of protests that captured global attention. The farmers' protest erupted in response to controversial new agricultural laws introduced by the Indian government, which farmers feared would undermine their livelihoods. The reforms aimed at modernizing the sector included provisions that seemed to threaten the minimum support price system and potentially benefit large corporations over small farmers. The protests began with farmers from Punjab, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh, who rallied against the laws by staging road blockades and setting up massive encampments around New Delhi. These demonstrations quickly grew in size and scale, drawing national and international support. The farmers, equipped with tractors and tents, established a formidable presence that became a symbol of their determination. The Indian government initially attempted to address the unrest through negotiations, but the movement's persistence led to significant concessions. In response to the mounting pressure, the government first agreed to temporarily suspend the new laws and eventually repealed them entirely in November 2021. This decision marked a major victory for the farmers and underscored the crucial role of inclusive policymaking. Number 2. Nigerian protest. In 2024, Nigeria became the stage for a powerful and widespread protest movement, fueled by growing frustration with economic hardship, political corruption, and poor public services. This wave of unrest, marked by diverse participation from students, activists, and ordinary citizens, demanded significant changes in governance and policy. The protests erupted as Nigerians grappled with severe economic challenges, including high inflation and unemployment, while also contending with persistent issues of political corruption and ineffective public services. Demonstrators called for sweeping electoral reforms, stricter anti-corruption measures, and substantial improvements in healthcare, education, and infrastructure. As the movement gained momentum, it led to nationwide demonstrations and clashes with security forces. The Nigerian government, recognizing the scale and intensity of the protests, engaged in negotiations and offered some concessions. However, despite these efforts, the clashes between protesters and security forces underscored the deep-seated frustrations and the urgent need for meaningful reform. Number 1. The Vietnam War protest. The Vietnam War protests during the 1960s and 1970s were a defining moment in American history, symbolizing the growing disillusionment with government policies and a shift in societal values. The movement, which began as a small, scattered opposition, soon swelled into a powerful force that influenced public opinion and U.S. foreign policy. Central to the protests was widespread opposition to the military draft, which disproportionately affected young men from lower-income backgrounds and minority communities, fueling anger and resentment. Key events like the March on Washington in 1965, where tens of thousands gathered to voice their opposition, and the tragic Kent State shooting in 1970, where National Guard troops killed 4 students, became emblematic of the deep divisions within the country. The protests during the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago further highlighted the growing tensions as demonstrators clashed with police in violent confrontations broadcast to a shocked nation. These protests were not just about ending the war, they were part of a broader cultural revolution that questioned authority, challenged traditional values, and demanded greater civil rights. The anti-war movement played a crucial role in pushing the government to reduce military involvement in Vietnam, ultimately contributing to the U.S. withdrawal in 1973. We are coming to an end here today. Thanks for watching, and for such top listing videos, subscribe to our channel.